Jake Morrison wiped the grease from his hands and looked at the broken engine one more time. 3 years ago, he was fixing trucks in a small town in Ohio. Now he was trying to repair alien technology on a planet millions of miles from Earth. Life had a funny way of changing everything in a moment. The alarm bells started ringing across the military base. Jake dropped his tools and grabbed his rifle. The Void Syndicate had found them again. This was the third attack this month, and each time they got closer to breaking through the defenses. Jake ran toward the assembly point where his squad was gathering. Sergeant Rodriguez was shouting orders over the noise. The plan was simple: protect the evacuation ships and make sure the royal family got off the planet safely. The Zephyrian Empire had been fighting the Void Syndicate for years, but they were losing badly. Their homeworld was already destroyed, and now they were running from planet to planet, trying to stay alive. The humans had only been part of the Galactic Alliance for 5 years. Most alien species thought they were too primitive to be useful in a real war. Jake had heard the comments from other soldiers. The tall blue Centaurians called humans barbarians. The floating gas creatures from Nebula Prime said humans were too violent. Even the friendly tree-like beings from Garden World treated humans like children who needed protection. But Jake did not care what they thought. He had a job to do, and he was going to do it well. His unit was assigned to guard the underground tunnels where the civilians were hiding. The crystal caverns beneath the capital city were supposed to be the safest place on the planet. The thick rock walls could stop most weapons, and there were dozens of escape routes. The first explosion shook the ground beneath Jake's feet. The Syndicate ships were bombing the surface defenses. Through his radio, he could hear reports from other units. The enemy had broken through the orbital shields. Landing ships were touching down near the spaceport. This was going to be a hard fight. Jake's squad moved into the tunnel entrance and set up defensive positions. The caverns stretched deep into the planet and were filled with glowing crystals that gave off a soft blue light. Thousands of civilians were moving through the tunnels toward the evacuation ships. Most of them were Zephyrians with their pale skin and silver hair. Jake could see the fear in their large purple eyes as they hurried past carrying their children and belongings. The Zephyrians were famous throughout the galaxy for their mental powers. They could read thoughts and move objects with their minds. Some of the strongest ones could even control other people's actions. But their psychic abilities did not seem to help much against the Syndicate's weapons. Fear was still fear, no matter how powerful your mind was. More explosions echoed through the tunnels. The Syndicate forces were getting closer. Jake checked his ammunition and waited for orders. He had been in combat before, but never anything like this. The Syndicate soldiers were known for being ruthless. They did not take prisoners, and they did not show mercy. Suddenly Jake's radio crackled with urgent voices. The main defense line had been overrun. Syndicate troops were entering the caverns from 3 different directions. Jake's squad was ordered to fall back and protect the royal family's escape route. But as they moved deeper into the tunnels, the explosions got louder and the ground kept shaking. That was when Jake got separated from his unit. A massive blast brought down part of the tunnel ceiling between him and the rest of his squad. Jake found himself alone in a side passage filled with glowing crystals and the sound of dripping water. His radio was making static noises, but he could not reach anyone. Jake moved carefully through the narrow tunnel, checking each corner for enemies. The crystal light made strange shadows on the walls. He could hear gunfire in the distance, but it was hard to tell which direction it was coming from. The tunnel system was like a maze, and Jake realized he was completely lost. He was about to try a different passage when he heard a soft sound coming from a small cave ahead. Jake raised his rifle and moved closer. Someone was in there, and they were trying very hard to be quiet. It could be a syndicate soldier setting a trap, or it could be a civilian who needed help. Jake peered around the corner and saw a young woman sitting against the cave wall. She had the pale skin and silver hair of a Zephyrian, but she was wearing simple clothes instead of the fancy robes most of them preferred. She was holding an old data pad, and her hands were shaking with fear. When she saw Jake, she pressed herself further against the wall and looked like she wanted to disappear. Jake lowered his rifle and spoke softly. He told her his name and said he was there to help. The woman looked at him with wide purple eyes and whispered that her name was Lyra. She said she was lost and scared and did not know how to get back to the evacuation ships. Jake noticed something different about this woman. Most Zephyrians he had met carried themselves with confidence because of their mental powers. But Lyra seemed more like a regular person who was just trying to survive a terrible situation. She reminded him of people back home who were good and honest, but not particularly special in any obvious way. Jake made a decision that would change everything. Instead of just pointing her toward the evacuation routes, he decided to stay with her and make sure she got to safety. He had no idea that this choice would make him the most famous human in the galaxy. Jake helped Lyra to her feet and checked the data pad she was carrying. The screen was filled with technical diagrams and tactical information about syndicate ships and weapons. He asked her where she got this information and why she was studying enemy technology. Lyra explained that she spent most of her time in the Royal Library, reading about military history and analyzing battle reports. Unlike her sisters who had powerful psychic abilities, she could only use her mind for thinking and learning. She said that most people considered her useless because she could not read thoughts or move objects like other Zephyr IANS. Jake looked at the information on her data pad more carefully. The diagram showed weak points in syndicate shield generators and communication systems. There were detailed notes about their attack patterns and supply routes. This was not random information. Someone had spent years studying these enemies and figuring out how to defeat them. The sound of gunfire was getting closer, and Jake knew they needed to move. But as they walked through the tunnels, Lyra kept pointing out things that Jake would never have noticed. She showed him hidden passages that were not on any map. She explained how the crystal formations affected radio signals and which routes the syndicate soldiers would most likely use. When they reached a junction where 3 tunnels met, Jake was ready to pick one at random. But Lyra studied the air currents and listened to the echoes of distant explosions. She pointed to the left tunnel and said the syndicate forces were coming from the right. A middle tunnel led to a dead end where they would be trapped. The left passage would take them toward the main evacuation point, but they would have to be very careful. As they moved through the left tunnel, Jake realized that Lyra knew more about what was happening than anyone else he had met. She could predict where the enemy would go and how they would attack. Her information about their weapons and tactics was incredibly detailed and accurate. They came to a large cavern where Jake could see syndicate soldiers setting up some kind of device near the far wall. Lyra looked at the machine and whispered that it was a signal jammer. If the enemy activated it, the evacuation ships would not be able to coordinate their escape. Hundreds of civilians would be trapped underground with no way to call for help. Jake counted 6 enemy soldiers and knew he could not fight them all in a direct attack. But Lyra was studying the crystal formations on the ceiling. She explained that if someone could hit the right spot with an explosion, the crystals would fall and destroy the jamming device. The trick was knowing exactly where to aim and how much. Forced to use. Jake had never heard of using cave crystals as weapons, but Lyra's calculations looked correct. She had studied the geological reports of these caverns and understood how the crystal structures worked. Jake positioned himself carefully and threw a grenade at the exact spot Lyra had indicated. The explosion brought down a shower of sharp crystals that destroyed the jamming device and scattered the enemy soldiers. Jake and Lyra used the confusion to slip past them and continue toward the evacuation point. But this was only the beginning of what they would accomplish together. At the next checkpoint, they found a group of human soldiers who were pinned down by Syndicate snipers. The enemy had taken positions in crystal formations that gave them perfect cover and clear shots at anyone trying to cross the cavern. The human commander was planning a frontal assault that would probably get most of his men killed. Lyra studied the sniper positions and pointed out something important. The crystals that were protecting the enemy soldiers were also creating blind spots in their vision. She had memorized the light patterns in these caverns and knew exactly where someone could move without being seen. Jake explained Lyra's plan to the commander. Instead of charging across the open space, they would use the crystal shadows to approach the snipers from angles they could not cover. It sounded crazy, but the alternative was a suicide attack that would definitely fail. Plan worked perfectly. Jake and 3 other soldiers were able to reach the sniper positions without being detected. They eliminated the enemy troops and secured the passage for the rest of the evacuation. The human commander asked Jake how he had figured out such an effective strategy. Jake told him the truth. The idea came from Lyra. Word of the successful attack spread quickly through the underground communication network. Other units started asking Jake for tactical advice. But every time someone presented him with a problem, Jake would quietly consult with Lyra first. She would study the situation and suggest solutions that no one else had considered. By the time they reached the main evacuation chamber, Lyra had helped coordinate attacks against 5 different Syndicate positions. Her understanding of enemy weaknesses and her knowledge of the cavern system had saved dozens of lives and prevented the capture of hundreds of civilians. The evacuation ships were loading the last groups of refugees when alarms started sounding. Again, Syndicate reinforcements had arrived, and they were bringing heavy weapons that could break through the cavern defenses. The royal family was still underground, and their escape ship was not ready to launch. Jake saw Princess Mira and Princess Vera directing their personal guards with telepathic commands. Both women were using their psychic powers to coordinate defenses and communicate with the ship crews. They were obviously skilled leaders, but they were also obviously struggling against an enemy that had adapted to fighting psychic opponents. Lyra watched her sisters work, and then showed Jake something on her datapad. She had been tracking Syndicate communication patterns and discovered that they were using a new type of mental shielding. The enemy soldiers could not be affected by telepathic attacks anymore. All the traditional Zephyrian advantages were useless, but Lyra had also found the weakness in the new shielding system. It required constant power from the Syndicate command ship in orbit. If someone could disrupt that power source, all the enemy soldiers on the planet would be vulnerable again. The problem was that the command ship was heavily defended and supposedly impossible to reach. Jake looked at Lyra's analysis and started forming a plan that would either save everyone or get him killed trying. The Grand Hall of Harmony Prime Station was filled with representatives from dozens of different worlds. Jake had never seen so many alien species in one place. There were tall blue Centaurians with their crystal armor. Floating gas beings from Nebula Prime moved through the air like living clouds. The tree-like people from Garden World stood in the corners with their roots extended into special soil containers. 6 months had passed since the battle that ended the war with the Void. Syndicate. Jake's successful attack on the enemy command ship had become legend throughout the galaxy. The official reports said that Sergeant Jake Morrison had single-handedly infiltrated the most heavily defended vessel in the Syndicate fleet and destroyed their primary weapon systems. What the reports did not mention was how Jake had actually accomplished this impossible mission. They did not explain that every move he made was based on tactical information provided by Princess Lyra. They did not Describe how her analysis of syndicate technology had revealed the exact weaknesses he needed to exploit. The galaxy celebrated Jake as a military genius, but he knew the truth was more complicated. Emperor Valdris stood at the center of the Great Hall, wearing robes that seemed to be made of liquid starlight. His 3 daughters stood beside him in order of importance. Princess Mira commanded the Third Fleet, and her telepathic powers were so strong she could influence entire crews of soldiers. Princess Vera served as the Empire's chief diplomat and could read the thoughts of anyone she met. Princess Lyra stood at the end of the line, wearing simple white robes that made her look more like a servant than a member of the royal family. She kept her eyes down and seemed to be trying to make herself invisible. Jake noticed that none of the other dignitaries paid any attention to her. As far as they were concerned, she might as well not have been there. The ceremony began with speeches from various alliance leaders. They praised Jake's courage and tactical brilliance. They talked about how his victory had saved billions of lives and brought peace to the galaxy. General Adams spoke about humanity's growing importance in galactic affairs and how Jake represented the best qualities of his species. Jake stood at attention and tried to look dignified, but his mind kept wandering to the events that had really won the war. He remembered Lyra's quiet voice explaining syndicate communication protocols. He thought about her careful analysis of enemy ship designs and her predictions about their battle strategies. Every major decision he had made during the final assault was based on information that came from her research. When Emperor Valdris finally stepped forward to offer Jake his reward, the entire hall fell silent. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The Emperor's voice carried easily through the vast space as he explained that Jake could ask for anything within his power to grant. Territory, military rank, wealth, political position, even marriage to one of his daughters. The assembled representatives began whispering among themselves about what Jake might choose. The smart political move would be to ask for a governorship or a high military position. Marriage to Princess Myra would give humanity influence over the Third Fleet. Princess Vera could provide access to diplomatic networks throughout the galaxy. Jake looked out at the crowd of alien faces, all waiting to see what the famous human hero would decide. He saw General Adams nodding encouragingly and knew his commanding officer expected him to make a choice that would benefit Earth and humanity. This was the chance to secure humanity's place among the major powers of the galaxy. But when Jake's eyes found Lyra standing quietly beside her sisters, he remembered something important. During their time together in the Crystal Caverns, she had never once tried to take credit for her ideas. She had simply shared her knowledge and helped him understand what needed to be done. While her sisters commanded fleets and influenced minds, Lyra had actually won the war through pure intelligence and careful observation. Jake stepped forward and spoke in a clear voice that carried throughout the hall. He thanked Emperor Valdris for the generous offer and said he was honored by the trust being placed in him. Then he made his request. He asked for permission to marry Princess Lyra. The reaction was immediate and intense. Alien nobles throughout the hall began talking loudly among themselves. Jake could hear words like foolish and wasteful being translated by the universal communication system. Even Emperor Valdris looked confused and asked Jake if he was certain about his choice. General? Adams pushed through the crowd and pulled Jake aside. He whispered urgently that this was humanity's best chance to gain real power in galactic politics. Princess Lyra brought no military assets and no political advantages. She was considered the weakest member of the royal family. Why would Jake throw away such an incredible opportunity? Other human officers joined the conversation. They pointed out that Princess Mira could help humanity build a powerful fleet. Princess Vera could open diplomatic doors that would take decades to unlock. Otherwise, Princess Lyra offered nothing except a symbolic marriage that would be forgotten within a year. Jake listened to their arguments and understood their concerns. From a purely political perspective, his choice made no sense. But politics was not what motivated his decision. He had spent enough time with Lyra to recognize something that everyone else had missed. She was not the weakest princess. She was the most valuable person in the entire royal family. Princess Mira approached Jake with her eyes glowing with psychic energy. She tried to probe his mind to understand his reasoning, but found that human thoughts were harder to read than she expected. She asked him directly why he would choose her powerless sister over someone who could actually help him achieve his goals. Jake's answer surprised everyone within hearing distance. He said that Princess Lyra had already helped him achieve the most important goal imaginable. She had ended a war that was destroying the galaxy. Her intelligence and insight had made victory possible. The fact that she accomplished this without psychic powers or military command made her more impressive, not less. The crowd grew quiet as Jake continued speaking. He explained that the galaxy needed leaders who could think clearly and solve problems through analysis rather than force. Princess Lyra represented a different kind of strength that could prevent future conflicts instead of just winning them after they started. Valdris studied Jake's face carefully and seemed to be reconsidering his initial reaction. The old ruler had lived through many wars and had seen how psychic powers and military might could create as many problems as they solved. Perhaps there was wisdom in choosing a daughter who relied on intelligence instead of supernatural abilities. Princess Lyra herself looked shocked by Jake's words. For the first time since the ceremony began, she raised her eyes and looked directly at him. Jake could see that she was trying to understand why anyone would value her contributions when she had been dismissed and ignored by everyone else for her entire life. That evening, Jake found himself alone with Princess Lyra in a small garden on Harmony Prime Station. The artificial trees and flowers were designed to make different species feel comfortable, but Jake thought they just looked strange. Lyra sat on a bench made of some kind of crystal that glowed softly in the artificial moonlight. She had been quiet during the formal dinner after the ceremony. While other guests celebrated and made speeches about the new alliance between humanity and the Zephyrian Empire, Lyra had barely spoken to anyone. Jake could see that she was thinking deeply about something, and he suspected he knew what was troubling her. Finally, Lyra broke the silence. She asked Jake why he had really chosen her. She said she had spent her whole life watching people make decisions based on personal gain or political advantage. Everyone always had an angle or a hidden motive. She wanted to know what Jake hoped to accomplish by marrying the least powerful member of the royal family. Jake sat down beside her on the crystal bench and considered how to explain his reasoning. He knew that Lyra had been hurt many times by people who underestimated her or treated her as unimportant. She had learned to be suspicious of anyone who claimed to see value in her abilities. He started by telling her about his life before the war. Jake described growing up in a small town where everyone knew each other and people were judged by their character rather than their wealth or status. He explained how his father had taught him to look for quality in unexpected places and to value substance over appearance. Jake joined the military. He had met many soldiers who were impressive on paper, but could not handle real challenges when they arose. He had also met quiet people who seemed ordinary until circumstances revealed their true strength. The war had taught him that the most dangerous enemies were often the ones who looked harmless, and the most valuable allies were sometimes the ones everyone else ignored. Lyra listened carefully, but Jake could see she was still not convinced. She pointed out that her sisters had years of experience commanding fleets and negotiating treaties. They had proven their worth through concrete achievements. What had she ever accomplished that would justify choosing her over them? Jake's answer revealed the depth of his understanding that had escaped everyone else, including Lyra herself. He reminded her of their time together in the crystal caverns during the final battle. Every tactical decision that led to victory had been based on information and analysis that came from her research. He described how she had identified the weakness in the Syndicate's signal jamming equipment. Her knowledge of crystal formations had made it possible to destroy the device without getting killed in the process. Her understanding of enemy communication patterns had revealed the vulnerability in their mental shielding system. Jake explained that when he infiltrated the Syndicate command ship, he was not acting on his own tactical genius as the official. Reports claimed he was following a plan that Lyra had developed through careful study of their technology and battle strategies. Every move he made was based on her analysis of their defensive systems and crew procedures. The successful attack that ended the war was actually her victory. Jake had simply been the tool that implemented her strategy. But because she lacked psychic powers and military rank, nobody recognized her contribution. The galaxy celebrated him as a hero, while the person who actually deserved credit remained invisible. Lyra stared at Jake in amazement. She said that nobody had ever given her credit for anything important before. Her father valued her sisters because their abilities were obvious and impressive. Military leaders respected commanders who could move fleets with their thoughts. Diplomats admired negotiators who could influence minds across star systems. But Jake saw something that others missed. While her sisters relied on supernatural gifts that could be blocked or countered, Lyra had developed abilities that were much more valuable in the long run. Her intelligence could not be jammed like psychic powers. Her analytical skills worked against any enemy, regardless of their technology. Her empathy and understanding of different species made her a natural bridge between worlds that had been fighting for generations. Jake told Lyra that the galaxy was about to face new challenges that would require different kinds of leadership. The war with the Void Syndicate was over, but there would be other conflicts in the future. The alliance between different species was fragile and could break apart if old prejudices and misunderstandings were not addressed. What the galaxy needed was not more commanders who could destroy enemies or diplomats who could manipulate minds. It needed leaders who could help different species understand each other and work together toward common goals. It needed people who could solve problems through wisdom rather than force. Lyra possessed exactly those qualities. Her years of being overlooked and dismissed had taught her to understand what it felt like to be powerless. She could relate to species that were considered inferior or unimportant by the major galactic powers. Her analytical mind could find solutions that satisfied multiple parties instead of just imposing the will of the strongest. Jake explained that he was not choosing her out of pity or as some kind of political statement. He was choosing her because she was the most brilliant strategist he had ever met and the most capable leader the galaxy had produced in generations. A fact that others could not see her value was their failure, not hers. For the first time since Jake had known her, Lyra smiled with genuine happiness instead of polite courtesy. She said that she had always hoped someone would eventually recognize that intelligence and empathy were just as important as psychic powers and military strength. She had spent years developing her abilities and waiting for a chance to prove their worth. Jake realized that his choice would do more than create a personal relationship between them. It would send a message throughout the galaxy that different kinds of strength deserved recognition and respect. Species that had been dismissed as weak or primitive might find new confidence to contribute their own unique abilities to the galactic community. The marriage would also represent a new model for cooperation between worlds. Instead of alliances based on military power or economic advantage, it would demonstrate the value of partnerships built on mutual understanding and complementary skills. Jake's human perspective combined with Lyra's alien wisdom could create something entirely new. In galactic politics, The wedding ceremony took place 3 months later on the neutral world of Haven. Representatives from over 50 different species attended the event that many were calling the most important diplomatic occasion in galactic history. What had started as a simple reward for military service was becoming a symbol of new possibilities for cooperation between worlds. Emperor Valdus had initially been puzzled by Jake's choice, but he gradually came to understand the wisdom behind it. During the months leading up to the wedding, he had several long conversations with his youngest daughter. For the first time in years, he actually listened to her ideas about galactic politics and interspecies relations. Lyra's insights impressed her father more than he expected. She had been quietly observing and analyzing galactic affairs for her entire life. Her understanding of the tensions between different species was deeper than that of most professional diplomats. Her suggestions for preventing future conflicts were both practical and innovative. The Emperor realized that he had been making the same mistake as everyone else. He had focused on his daughter's obvious abilities while ignoring their less visible qualities. Princess Myra was an excellent military commander, but she tended to solve problems through force. Princess Vera was skilled at reading minds, but she sometimes relied too heavily on manipulation instead of honest communication. Princess Lyra offered something different. Her approach to problem-solving emphasized understanding and cooperation, rather than dominance or control. She could find common ground between species that had been enemies for generations. Her methods were slower than military conquest or psychic influence, but they produced more lasting results. The wedding ceremony itself reflected this new approach to galactic relations. Instead of the traditional Zephyrian ritual that focused on the joining of powerful bloodlines, Jake and Lyra created their own ceremony that emphasized partnership and mutual respect. Representatives from many species contributed elements from their own cultures to create something entirely new. After the wedding, Jake and Lyra established their residence on Haven and began working together on projects that neither could have accomplished alone. Their first major success was mediating a dispute between the Centauran Republic and the Aquatic Federation that had been threatening to escalate into open warfare. The conflict had started over mining rights in a star system that contained both crystal formations valued by the Centaurians and water planets needed by the aquatic species. Traditional diplomacy had failed because each side viewed the situation as a zero-sum game where one species had to lose for the other to win. Jake and Lyra approached the problem differently. Instead of trying to force a compromise, they spent months studying the actual needs of both species. They discovered that the Centaurians only needed specific types of crystals that formed in certain geological conditions. The Aquatic Federation required water worlds with particular chemical compositions. The solution they proposed satisfied both parties completely. The star system contained multiple planets and asteroid belts that could meet everyone's requirements without any conflict. The problem had never been a shortage of resources. It had been a failure to understand what each species actually needed versus what they thought they wanted. This success led to requests for assistance with other disputes throughout the galaxy. Jake and Lyra found themselves traveling from world to world, helping to resolve conflicts that had seemed impossible to settle. Their method was always the same. Instead of imposing solutions, they would study each situation carefully until they understood the real issues involved. Their work gradually attracted attention from young leaders across many species who were interested in learning new approaches to diplomacy and conflict resolution. Jake and Lyra established the Morrison Valdus Institute for Interspecies Cooperation to train the next generation of galactic leaders. The institute taught students to value different kinds of intelligence and to look for solutions that benefited everyone involved. It emphasized the importance of understanding other species, perspectives, and finding common ground rather than trying to dominate or manipulate opponents. Students came from worlds throughout the galaxy to study at the Institute. Many of them were individuals who had been overlooked by their own societies because they lacked the qualities that were traditionally valued. Like Lyra, they possessed intelligence and empathy that could be more valuable than obvious displays of power. The success of the Institute began to change attitudes throughout the galactic community. Species that had been dismissed as weak or primitive found new confidence to share their unique perspectives and abilities. The alliance between different worlds became stronger as more leaders learned to work together effectively. Jake and Lyra's marriage also had unexpected effects on human society. Earth had always struggled to find its place among the advanced civilizations of the galaxy. Humans were often seen as aggressive and unpredictable by species that valued order and control. Jake's choice to value intelligence over power and his partnership with Lyra demonstrated that humans could offer something valuable to galactic civilization. Other species began to recognize that human unpredictability could be an asset when it was combined with wisdom and understanding. 5 Years after their wedding, Jake and Lyra faced their greatest challenge when a new crisis threatened to destroy everything they had built. A coalition of military leaders from several species attempted to overthrow the galactic government and establish a new order based on strength and conquest rather than cooperation and understanding. The rebels dismissed Jake and Lyra as naive idealists whose peaceful methods were useless against real threats. They claimed that only military force could maintain order in a dangerous galaxy. They gathered fleets from multiple worlds and prepared to attack anyone who opposed their vision of galactic rule. But the rebels had underestimated the changes that had taken place over the previous 5 years. The network of leaders trained at the Morrison Valdris Institute was now spread throughout the galaxy. When the crisis began, these leaders worked together to organize resistance that the rebels had not expected. Instead of fighting fleet against fleet, the resistance used the same methods that Jake and Lyra had developed for resolving disputes. They studied the rebels' actual motivations and found ways to address their concerns without resorting to violence. Many of the rebel leaders were convinced to abandon their plans when they realized their goals could be achieved through cooperation rather than conquest. The crisis ended not with a great battle, but with a series of negotiations that transformed the galactic government into something stronger and more representative. The rebels' legitimate concerns about security and order were addressed through reforms that gave all species a greater voice in galactic affairs. Jake looked back on everything that had happened since that day in the Crystal Caverns and realized that choosing Lyra had been the most important decision of his life. Not because it had brought him personal happiness, although it certainly had done that, but because it had shown the galaxy that true strength came from recognizing value in unexpected places and building partnerships based on mutual respect rather than dominance. The human soldier had chosen the weakest alien princess as his reward, and his reason had surprised everyone. But perhaps the most unexpected thing of all was how that choice had changed the entire galaxy for the better.